Welcome to this Architecture Today webinar with Schueco, Cradle to Cradle. Don't forget, you can ask questions or comment throughout by clicking Ask Your Question, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So let's get started with Schueco UK's Commercial Director, Sean Butler.
Welcome to the third in a series of online events in partnership with Architecture Today. These events are proving extremely popular, and once again, expecting more than 400 people to join us for this webinar based on the registrations that have already been signed up. Thank you for your support. You're about to hear from 4 sustainability experts on the concepts of cradle to cradle and how that could and should relate to buildings and products. It's a philosophy that plays a crucial part in Schueco's sustainability approach and now forms the basis of all of our product developments. We understand that the buildings that we design today determine how generations will live and work. This means that it's crucial to meet the standards tomorrow, today. We believe that Schueco is one of the sustainability pioneers within the construction industry. We now have 43 systems that are C2C certified with silver status and 4 more have bronze certification. We anticipate that the need and demand for these certificates will increase significantly. I'll be very interested to hear what our panelists think are the next steps as an industry on our journey towards building and products that are truly recyclable. Thank you once again for joining us, and I will now pass you over to Ruth Slavid, who is chairing this event.
So thank you very much indeed, Sean. I'm very happy to be here chairing this, and I think we have a fascinating subject. I think that this is probably the kind of next stage we need to talk about when we talk about sustainability. And I'm interested to hear from each of our really good speakers what their interpretation of this is. As I see it quite simply, and I stand to be corrected when they speak, cradle to cradle is to do with having a building made in a way where when it comes to the end of its life, there's been no more damage to the environment than it was before it started. I see that, I understand that to be that everything is either reusable at a high level or disappears into the dirt. And I have to say, when I think about it, the only completely C2C building I can think of is a dry stone wall, but I guess everything else can aspire to go towards that. So I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers. Each speaker is going to give us a little introduction to their view of this. And the first one is Duncan Baker-Brown, architect, BBM Design. And Duncan, it would be great if you could explain where you're coming from and what you see as being C2C. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this discussion. Yeah, I've been lucky enough to be involved in sustainable design and closed loop systems for over 25 years. I've been involved in projects that have tried to enable closed loop systems. So from my point of view, at the moment, that humankind is the only organism on planet Earth that exists as a linear system. You know, we take, we make, and we throw away stuff. We trash the joint, move on, and try and build somewhere else. The rest of planet Earth exists as circular systems, circular metabolisms, we call them ecosystems, where waste from one ecosystem is food for another ecosystem. And this is what cradle to cradle and the circular economy is all about. Waste from one system is a resource from another. In the world where there's a circular economy, there's no such thing as waste, there's just stuff in the wrong place. So to facilitate a circular economy, we need the platforms and networks and knowledge to know that we just need to swap resources around rather than throwing it away. Like I said, I've been involved in this sort of thing since the early 1990s when I worked for Rick Mather Architects on the largest low energy scheme in Europe at the time, which was new student accommodation at UEA. But then more interestingly, in the late 90s, I was involved in the Greenwich Millennium Village, and there we were constructing buildings so there'd be material stores for the future. The idea is literally they're bolted together. You see the value in the asset of those materials, the embodied carbon, but also thinking about the ecological footprint, the amount of damage that's planet Earth has had to sustain just to get that material onto site to be used. So that's why one of the reasons you want to reuse it and reuse it, so you don't have to inflict that same damage on planet Earth again. So you think of buildings as material stores for the future, so they're bolted together. In practice, that's meant that you try and avoid the expanded foams for lots of reasons. You don't want to be using those, but the stuff that sticks buildings together, so those components become a monolith, that needs to be avoided. And that's the sort of problem I have with a lot of 3D printing at the moment. It's making new monoliths at the moment. So I'm more interested in smaller components that can be deconstructed one day. Now, I'm not advocating a mass demolition of stuff. I remember when Sunand was president of the RIBA and said that the whole retrofit program was a real opportunity for architects, which of course it is. I could also remember the reaction of a lot of architects at the time. That's quite a long time ago. But if you think at the moment, 90% of the population of the UK live in local authority regions that have declared a climate emergency and then said that they want to be net carbon zero within 10 years or 15 years. To do that, they all know that the next thing they need to look at is the built environment and the existing built environment. So from the circular economy and closed loop systems, we understand that we need to rework what's already there. And I'm involved with projects at the moment where people are deconstructing buildings that are normally demolished. So I'm working with Rota in Belgium at the moment, in Brussels, and they're looking at the part of the World Trade Center, which is from the 1990s, which was due to be demolished because nobody ever loved it. It was just a financial proposition. It's come to the end of its 25-year life. And at the end of its life, it's a financial deficit. But in the case of this part of the World Trade Center in Brussels, Rota are carefully deconstructing a building that would normally be thrown away. Those materials are being cleaned up and then they're being put into the supply chain for new buildings. This stuff is already happening. In addition to that, you can think of trying to avoid materials that have no end of life strategy, such as plastics, plastics are an amazing material, but they can now be replaced. So in terms of practice at the moment, we're doing a lot of trying to replace plastic insulation with organic options, including mycelium. So we have a project just received planning approval for Glyndebourne Opera House, which is a new building for them, where the insulation is being grown on site, as well as the material for the frame. In addition, we're using chalk that's on site to make lime mortar. And something like lime mortar is a really good circular option, because if you apply it with brickwork, you can reuse those bricks again and again. So for me, the circular economy is something that's been around for a long time. As a concept, it was, the first time I think it was used was in 1974 by Professor Walter Stahl, who's an architect. And I think there's a lack of knowledge in this country at the moment. It's a phrase that's out there at the moment. But I'm lucky enough to have written a book about the subject called the Reuse Atlas. And I also chair and curate symposia on the subject. So there's a lot of people in the Netherlands, in Denmark, Germany, and France who are doing this. Amsterdam is already 30% circular, apparently, as of last week. It's adopted circular zero waste practices for the last 5 years. It can be done. It's really exciting moving forward because we have all these local authorities with declarations. So they need to commit to their net zero targets. And for example, I'm working with Brighton Hove City Council at the moment to draw up a circular economy route map for the construction industry. So we're literally at the moment looking at how to deconstruct buildings that would normally be demolished. And we're looking at how the material sources for new buildings. So the source of the materials got to be low carbon sources, locally sourced material if possible. But then once you've designed that thing, it's got to be a material resource for the future. And just to sort of point out how different that is from what we do at the moment. At the moment, BMW would tell you that 80% of their cars are recyclable, but not into new BMWs. And in a circular economy, old BMWs are the source material for new BMWs. And as you said, Ruth, it's about the sophistication and the sort of hierarchy of the material. At the moment, BMWs are ground down into minerals and what have you to put into roads, etc. In the future, in the circular economy, when designers really have the time to redesign our everyday objects and everything, they will be genuinely resource materials for the future, and they won't be recycled. That's where most of the sort of circular stuff we're doing in this country is. It's all about recycling stuff on site. More importantly, and more sophisticatedly, it will be all about reuse. That's about it. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Duncan. Lots to think about. And I'm going to go on now to Marco Abdallah, who is Head of Engineering in the UK for Drees and Sommer. So you're coming to a view in the UK, having also worked in Germany previously. And I don't know whether that informs your thinking and informs what you want to talk about, but over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be part of the session today. And Cradle to Cradle for us, it's a very holistic approach to sustainability. It's more than just a material science. The overall ambition for us is to really create buildings with a positive footprint regarding carbon emissions, regarding materials, and also regarding biodiversity. And of course, circular economy with the focus on the material side is an essential part of it. And we believe that Cradle to Cradle has the potential to bring us the next revolution to the construction industry, to our real estate sector. And it has already brought a very, let's say, disruptive change to us as consultants at Drees and Sommer. We are in the construction business since 50 years with nearly 4,000 employees now around the globe. And our development was mainly driven by innovations such as Cradle to Cradle. If we look back 50 years ago, we started with project managements and topics like cost consultancy. We had then at the end of the 90s a very strong focus on energy efficiency, followed by green buildings in the early 2000 years. After 2005, green building certifications popped up. And I think during the last 10 years, we really saw a strong shift of the focus towards carbon emissions due to the climate change. And now I think the big topic is circular economy. And I think it's important to say that it's not only a topic, it's a complete approach, a solution to many problems in our industry. And that means it's also a great opportunity for every one of us. And we wanted to take that opportunity and recognize that we needed to adapt ourselves as consultants and to develop a new competence in that field. And therefore we merged with EPEA. EPEA was founded I think 30 years ago by Professor Michael Braungart. He's a German chemist, one of the pioneers in the early circular economy movement, who developed the cradle-to-cradle principles together with the American architect William McDonough. And they started to apply those principles on a product level. They developed and certified products with suppliers, and over the years they gathered a massive amount of experience. They created a huge material database, and with the know-how of EPEA, we are now able to apply that cradle-to-cradle approach to the real estate sector, where we believe that we can make a much larger impact. Because just to recall, at that point, our buildings are responsible for around 30% of the carbon emissions, and also 60% of the total waste production comes from the construction industry. I personally like very much the fact that Cradle to Cradle is a holistic approach which you can apply from an urban scale to the molecular level. So on an urban scale, we look into topics like urban mining, where we want to extract raw materials from our urban environment, from the cities, from the buildings we renovate, instead of sourcing them from the other side of the world and destroy the nature there. And on a building level, we then design building as material banks, which can be disassembled and recycled at the end of the life cycle. And by doing so, we also create a very healthy indoor environment. And that's what we did in the research project, the RHE in Germany. And we then go to the product level. We can develop products with suppliers, manufacturers, which can be upcycled. For example, with Schueco, we developed a cradle-to-cradle facade module, which at the end of the life cycle can become a new facade module. And then you automatically enter component levels and finally also substances. And I think this is where it starts to get really interesting, because if we look into the chemistry, we understand recyclability, and because that depends very much on the ingredients, what we use and how they are applied. And that's something we couldn't do with our colleagues from EPEA. They are scientists, they are chemists, they are toxologists. They provide a completely new approach and view on materials. To look on the bigger picture, to answer your question at the beginning, I think C2C has gained momentum in Europe. The hotspots are certainly the Netherlands, Belgium, France. I think Germany is catching up as well. And those are the regions where also we have most of our pilot projects. And I think in the UK, the topic is coming as well through the very strong approach towards zero carbon, because more or less all the zero carbon buildings we see today are net zero carbon in operation. And we often ignore that half of the emissions are embodied in the materials. And to reduce that embodied carbon is our biggest challenge. It's a huge challenge for architects, and Cradle to Cradle is the key to that, because if we simply reuse and recycle materials, we can easily skip all the carbon emissions which are related to the very energy intensive primary raw material sourcing process. And I think the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has done a research study here, and they came to the conclusion that Cradle to Cradle can help us here to reduce embodied carbon by 45%. So in a nutshell, we are very convinced that Cradle to Cradle is exactly what the construction sector needs. And I'm looking forward to discuss with you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move on now to Sunand Prasad, who's the principal of the architects Penoyre and Prasad, former president of the RIBA, and has been deeply involved with environmental issues for almost all of your career. Sunand.
Thank you, Ruth. And it's great to be part of this discussion, something that I, like the others, feel very passionate, but also excited about. In 1995, we designed a building which was to celebrate the millennium and to showcase sustainability, commissioned by the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, at a time when sustainability wasn't recognized as a word in the MS Word dictionary. And we took as our motto something that Glenn Murcutt had originally said, the architect, the great Australian architect, about touching the ground lightly. And we designed this building, which was designed to be entirely disassembled easily, taken away from the site, most of the materials reused. We hadn't realized that it was either cradle to cradle or circular economy, but looking back on it, I realized that we had designed a building that was, I would think, about 80% recyclable, and it would have been perhaps even more if the steel beams that we'd specified as recycled steel had been procured as that, but it was far cheaper for the contractor to get new steel. And that sort of illustrates an issue by itself. But looking back at that building and now understanding the circular economy, I realized that one of the reasons we got that building to be as circular as it was that it had a large component of biological materials. It had a lot of timber, which is easy to recycle, and it had relatively small weight of other materials, and the concrete and the paving slabs and so on were all reusable flags, effectively. I mean, stone is a surprisingly good material in the circular economy. So that's how I came into it. And for me, circularity, or the principle of circularity, cradle to cradle, whatever we call it, is in a sense the latest paradigm for an increasing understanding of the world and how we live with nature and how we live as nature. That has been evolving for 50, 60, 70, 80 more years. And it seems to have come to a point where there is a fantastic summation of what it is that we need to do to take into account what is, I think, one of the most elegant ways of understanding what's behind the circular economy, which is to say, we talk of throwing things away, but where is away? There is no away. And so we have to be circular. It's not a choice in the long-term future. It is something that we absolutely have to do. Now, away from the poetry of that kind of formulation, there are some very pragmatic facts about this. The building industry generates 60% of all waste to landfill. The use of buildings operationally accounts for 40% of carbon dioxide or equivalent emissions. And actually the construction of buildings, if you include that, and if you include roads and urban infrastructure, all of that is a very, very large part of the non-circularity of the world, of the fact that we are producing toxins and waste and not removing them. So why circular economy is a wonderful concept is that actually it does include the word economy in it. And it is interesting that a lot more has been done in terms of circularity in the non-building sectors than in the building sectors. And that's because taking individual products, for example, take carpets, it's actually relatively simpler in a single product to think of how one might recycle components, how one might, for example, reuse fishing nets to make carpets, and indeed coffee cups to make worktops and counters. Buildings are very, very complicated. And what is so challenging, but also very interesting about looking at the circular economy in terms of buildings is how much opportunity there is in this kind of vast landscape of different things that buildings are to invent and to create things that make a huge difference. You know, the construction industry has the power to make a dramatic difference to the circularity and the circular economy of the world. So in a nutshell, the stuff is running out, but it also saves money. There's good evidence that several £billion will be returned to the economy if we move to circularity. And there is a very interesting report by the European section of the World Health Organization that shows very clearly the fantastic health benefits of it too. So we're left with the how. We've sort of looked at the what and the why. How do we actually move towards a more circular construction industry? Well, firstly, it's not actually a new thing, this. It's not only going back to Stahl in 1974, but many, many cultures have been intrinsically practicing the circular economy. In India, you know, most things are recycled. Newspapers are made into bags. The cups that you drink out of return to the earth. So traditional societies actually had a lot of circularity. The buildings of London circa the Georgian era and before are still in use, having been effectively recycled several times with new uses. They demonstrate a key aspect of the circular economy, which is to keep the value, to keep things, materials, buildings, assemblies operating at their full value for as long as possible. How do we do that? And adaptive buildings and making things that can be reused is first part of it. If you look at every single material, that is the place to start. We have to really catalog and understand all the materials that go into the building and see how we can keep them operating at their maximum value, which is not the same as recycling. As we heard before, it's not a matter of smashing down BMWs to make something else, but it's actually to make more BMWs and reusing as much of that as possible. And that will require a lot of invention and a lot of imagination, both in products, but also in processes. So for example, in products, we need to, just as one example, avoid composite materials, which are very easy, very, very difficult to break apart. When I was studying as an architect, we were taught to design timber windows and draw all the sections. But now we, of course, order these from a catalog and they're provided by a supplier, and there can be a composite of 5 or 6 different materials glued together, and those are very difficult to take apart. But people are now inventing design for disassembly. They're working on ways of making buildings easily disassemblable, including assemblies of components, facades, and so on. And that is a fantastic potential opportunity. We need to track materials, as we've heard as well, so-called building passports, and people are investigating how blockchain technology can actually allow us to track the life of a material all the way from its extraction from the earth to its use, and perhaps reuse almost infinitely. Buildings effectively as materials banks, as we've also heard. But even more critical, I think, will be what sort of business models will not only enable but incentivize the use of circularity and incentivize naturally the urge and the ability to become more circular. So for example, in Schiphol airport, there is a experiment where Philips, the electrical company, light bulb company, are paid for the light that Schiphol needs, not for the bulbs, not for the electricity, but their job is to provide the light. So we could imagine that a lift company's job is to move people up and down in a building, and it's their responsibility then to do it as economically and sustainably as possible, and that would be naturally incentivizing of the circular economy. And there are those and other business models, and I think they are amongst the most encouraging and inventive parts of this.
Yes, no, it's been fascinating. I'm going to introduce our last speaker, who is Maria Smith, who is the fairly new Director of Sustainability at Buro Happold, having started life as an architect and having turned herself into an engineer as well. Maria, do you want to just talk to us briefly, and then we'll have a bit of discussion?
Sure. Hello, everybody, and thank you for including me in this conversation. Sunand, I could listen to you coming up with all of your brilliant ideas all day. So I'm really interested in the intersection of the built environment and the economy more broadly, and I think it's really brilliant that we're talking about a circular economy in the built environment much more seriously and often now, and that's really exciting that we've seen that over the last sort of decade or two. But I think what we really need as well, and what we need to zoom out to, is a genuinely circular economy, by which I mean an economy that incentivizes the fair distribution of scarce resources, and not a degenerative economy that we have now that incentivizes this kind of take, make, throw away culture that we have. We need to be incentivizing reciprocity and circularity. And part of the problem here is that we have this measure of GDP, which is king of all the measures of success, that we're constantly chasing. And when you build a building, GDP goes up. If you build a building out of composite materials, as Sunand's saying, that have been processed several times, that have changed hands several times, then GDP goes up even more. Unfortunately, also, if there's a flood that you need to repair or an oil spill that you need to clean up, GDP also goes up. So this current economic system that we have that chases this increasing GDP is not measuring the success of good sustainable behavior, and it's very difficult in many instances to sort of behave sustainably because the system, the wider economic system that we're operating within, is working against that. And instead, this is bringing us, it's incentivizing extraction of resources, of pollution, emissions, of loss of habitat and biodiversity, and just like huge, broad-ranging systemic inequality. And of course, part of the reason that we require this GDP growth is to manage debt, public and private debt, but it's also because of the kind of vested interests of the vested interests of the elites. And so we need to be unpicking that broader economic story as well, and freeing ourselves from those dependencies on that ever-growing GDP in order to create a genuinely circular economy. So why do I talk about that in a conversation about sort of architecture and engineering and the circular economy? Well, I think that architects and engineers have a really important part to play in this wider shift as well. As other speakers have said, we are a huge kind of proponent of carbon emissions and other kind of environmental damage indicators. But most architects and engineers went into uni thinking, they've got creative, artistic, scientific ambitions, and a huge genuinely a social conscience. And then you come into industry, and you suddenly find yourself working in the property industry, this incredible driver of growth. And so I think that we need to recognize that we are complicit in this wider problem, and can be part of the solution of this wider problem, moving us towards a genuinely circular economy.
I think that's an interesting point from which to move on. And I think perhaps what might be interesting is to look at that in some of the context of the changes that we're experiencing at the moment, the effects of the pandemic, which not only do we have a government which is going to try to stimulate the economy back out of this, but at the same time, we have a serious housing shortage. It's interesting that Sunand, I think, said that this could be a less expensive way of building, but I don't know whether immediate economic pressures are going to recognise that. On the other hand, possibly we're going to need fewer buildings if no one's going back to their offices. And at the same time, after we've all been very lovely and touchy and feely in lockdown, as soon as IKEA and Primark reopened, there were the immense queues outside. Let's shop. So I'm just interested to see, and I don't know who'd like to speak first, how you feel that our current situation is likely to have an impact on progress towards a circular approach to construction. I might go to Marco first, because I think it's very interesting that you are very much looking at this from the very small to the very large scale. And after that, I think Duncan's got something he wants to say. So, Marco.
Yeah, I think, let me try to answer the question. I think sustainability could really benefit from the situation we have right now. There are lots of investments which can be directed towards a more sustainable future. That's what we hope will happen. And I think there are already some quite good movements we have seen in the past months. The Green Deal from the European Union is including circular economy requirements. And I think those large-scale regulations, they have the power to really move the market in the right direction.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Duncan.
Yeah, I'm being asked this all the time at the moment. We are obviously being encouraged by all the big corporates to, get in our cars, live like we did before March the 13th lockdown in the UK, and concurring that we are doing exactly that. However, last year, 814 million people around the world did declare that there was a climate emergency, and most people think we've got about a decade to sort it out. So if you're just going to carry on business as usual, what is your future? Please tell me. So I think there's a lot of people getting really real about this in the construction industry. There was a paper produced by MIROG, Major Infrastructure Resource Group, last autumn, which presented a case for a resource exchange, which is, people swapping stuff, excess materials, surplus materials. And so I just think we are at this sort of tipping point now. If we do nothing about this and carry on as business as usual, I don't want to say what's going to happen, because I can't think of a way from a 5 degrees temperature increase by the end of this century. That we are sitting on planet Earth at the moment. We've never had temperatures as high as we have this year so far. So we're going to carry on doing this. And I think we have a moral duty as practitioners in the construction industry to do something about it. And what I'm really excited about is the fact that you've got at the moment a consensus as of February this year with the RIBA, the UK Green Building Council, and LETI, the London Energy Transition Initiative, all concurring with this embodied and in use carbon descent plan from to 2030, 40, 50. I think we are agreeing and understanding what to do. And at the moment, I'm inundated with consultants, engineers of all kinds, who are really understanding embodied carbon now. So I think that we're in a different world. And we, to be honest, we don't have to make a big deal about a lot of it. If a lot of it, with regards to reducing the amount of buildings that get demolished, if you talk to Rota and other people I'm working with, it's basic stuff. Architects are really well placed to understand how to deconstruct a building from any era. I agree completely with Sunand that buildings before about 1910 you cannot easily deconstruct, but actually you can deconstruct a lot of them We just think they're harder, and they are harder than Georgian buildings. And we have lived, another thing to remind ourselves is we've lived in harmony, pretty much harmony with planet Earth for quite a long time.
Exactly.
And, the circular economy, quite right, is not a new deal. It's a new deal for the West.
Yeah.
But I work with a lot of people who are in the world of waste management, and I'll finish on this point. The concept of waste, in a way, was invented by imperialist English people in about 1861, where we were just sort of showing off how much resources we were plundering from the rest of the world, so we could actually make bricks out of new material. Before then, bricks are made out of all sorts of stuff, and I'll hand over to other people.
Yeah, well, we'll hand over to Sunand. And can I just ask you, Sunand, before you start? I'm also quite interested, as well as I think the big point you're going to make. I'm interested in the question of how much we can hit aspirations to have very airtight buildings, etc., without a lot of sticky stuff.
Okay, I'll tackle that. But there's something crying out to be done. We have over 20 million homes, all of which need to be retrofitted, all of which, by definition, are spread out all over the country and thereby are part of their local economies, and their retrofitting, their energy efficiency upgrades is a fabulous opportunity not only to tackle carbon emissions, but also to keep buildings in longer use than they otherwise would be, and to create jobs and prosperity in local places. And coming out of the post-COVID recession, what better than to have a new Green Deal, as it's sometimes called by many people, that will actually begin to fix this long-term problem while also dealing with the short-term consequences of an economic recession. So I think that there is absolutely something that can follow directly on the heels of the pandemic, which can actually make a fantastic difference. And now is the time to do it. And I don't see any reason not to do it. I'm actually really baffled. People have been talking about this now for 20 years, but it isn't happening. And it's mind-bending that it's not happening. Now, if while doing that, do we make them airtight or not? And is that a problem? I happen to live in a house that I made airtight, or pretty airtight. It's not as airtight as the highest standards, which like passive house, but it's pretty close. And we have extraordinarily fresh air in our house because of the well-detailed ventilation system, which runs with a low power fan. Much of it actually can be powered by the PVs we have, and we have an energy loss rate which is very, very low for homes, and we have low bills. And in time, they might not pay for themselves immediately, but these measures do get paid for in time. So I don't see any alternative to, in the coldest time, to have airtightness, but I don't think it should be airtightness all the year round. I don't think anybody needs airtight buildings in the summer. They want to open windows like we do and to have outside coming in. We don't want to lose the dream of the interpenetration of external internal space in the kind of mad rush to airtightness.
Thank you very much. Now we're getting to the point at which we're going to have to start taking some of the questions from our speakers. So I'm just going from our audience. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, and I just want to know whether before we get to those questions, anyone has anything brief that they're very much burning to say.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing that I think is really important when we're talking about a recovery from COVID, in terms of an economic recovery from COVID. And that's the understanding that this pandemic is one of the terrifying faces of the ecological crisis that we're facing. This isn't a competing interest for sustainability. You know, the reason that so many of the pressures that we created through our kind of unsustainable land use and the kind of, as Duncan was saying, you know, imperialism and colonialism and all of that kind of really damaging behaviour that we've been carrying out for the last hundreds of years are part of the reason that we put so much pressure on our ecosystems that this has occurred. So I think it's really important that we all understand that this is not a competing interest. We have to tackle the broader ecological crisis. Otherwise, we're just going to be back here again and worse, and So I think it's just really important to have all that in our minds as we go about a green recovery.
Thanks so much, Maria. And now we will move on to our questions from the audience. Thank you.
Dave here, producing for AT. We're having problems with Ruth's audio and camera. So, guys, I'm just going to pick up and pick up the questions which I can from a separate screen because I'm not experiencing the same problems that Ruth clearly is. So let's just have a look and see what we have. As office and commercial spaces will reduce due to more people working from home post-COVID, home living spaces will have to increase in size with more access to external spaces. How do we integrate these flexible cradle to cradle ideas into that thinking? So let's first of all, can I come to you with that one, Maria?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's what's been so interesting about COVID is that we're seeing that the way that we're using spaces sort of more creatively, more differently. I mean, for myself, I live with two performers. So my living room is now a TV studio or like a fitness studio, and it's become a film place. And I think we need to, it's really exploded the kind of opportunities that we can use our spaces more flexibly. And that's like a key component of circular economy thinking as well. Like we need to design sort of for that kind of adaptability and to create spaces that are essentially robust and can be used in lots of different ways without having to sort of create another super specialized space. And I think, we've learned personally like a lot of ingenuity about the way that we can adapt those spaces. So I think that kind of flexible use, as well as sort of flexibly being able to sort of physically recycle materials, but also being able to make use of existing spaces in lots of different ways was also really important. And then the other thing I'd say is that I think more being able to work remotely more does enable a more sustainable could enable a much more sustainable distribution of sort of inhabitants across different areas. We don't all need to cram into like super unsustainably high density areas where we're just backing the economy in the southeast because that's where it's sort of creating the most returns, and then sort of neglecting other parts of the regions of the country, for example, or other regions within cities. But if we are able to work more flexibly, then we can think more holistically about creating a sort of genuinely sustainable settlement, so that we can have sustainable transport and walkable, cyclable cities and things like that. That's much more possible if we can be better distributed and reach those kind of like Goldilocks densities. So there's a huge opportunity there for rethinking how we live and work and how we create sustainable communities.
Marco, can we get your view on that one?
Yeah, I think just wanted to add something to that, because I think the situation clearly shows us that reversibility is getting more and more important. We don't know how the future will look in 50 years. So we need to design buildings in a way that they can adapt to such situations. And I think that's the core principle of circular economy, that we can disassemble building, we look into more modular approaches, so that, for example, we can turn an office building easily into a residential building and really adapt to new requirements. So I think circular economy would really provide the right tool set and the right basis to allow that and promote that flexibility in the future.
Sunand, could we get your view on that?
I think COVID has two profound implications, one of which I think my colleagues have already covered well. I would just say that COVID itself is part of a phenomenon of our neglect of nature and our kind of very profligate and careless, unscientific approach really towards nature. It is part of eco damage. It's part of our relationship with the wild and natural world. And whether it's a wet market or whether it's mass production of animal products, I think that you got to see that in aggregate, and only the science will eventually trace exactly how it happened. But I think there's very sound evidence now from many organizations that the two are linked. So I think it's a call to arms in that sense for the circular economy. And then we also need to remember that there are certain things about the circular economy that are nothing to do with COVID too. It's not, there's, at the moment we are in the mood to try to pin COVID on everything, but things like use of composite materials, yes, of course there is an ecological aspect to that as well. And by the way, I wouldn't rule out composite materials. I think that if we can find a way of disassembling and still have composite materials, that's fine. And this is why this is an area of great potential invention. And COVID is a spur for us to undertake that.
Let's move on to another question, this time for Duncan. Laminated timber products such as CLT are full of glues, and yet they're very popular in so-called sustainable buildings. This is a question from Martin Neelan. What is the most sustainable structural material to use for low-rise structures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, CLT can have water-based glues, can have formaldehyde-free glues. When I personally specify formaldehyde-free ply all the time. So it's about getting the spec exactly right. So the source of the material being sustainable, and the way you stick it together being sustainable. I think we need to look at, in terms of what is the most sustainable approach to material specification for a building, whatever height it is, low rise or otherwise. I think it's about a lot of it about sourcing as locally to the site as possible, so you reduce the air miles and road miles associated with a building, so you get the embodied. Sorry, I've just got a train going past. It's nice the railways are working again, even though they haven't got anybody on the train. So for me, it's about there's this technique called resource mapping, which Superuse in Rotterdam pioneered, I think, and it's literally understanding what are the material sources near to your site. So whether that's a bit of existing infrastructure, a building itself, or the materials from a building that's being deconstructed instead of demolished. These are the sort of principles you should employ. It's no point demolishing a concrete building and then getting the most sustainable timber CLT or stud partition frame building, because of all that material you just thrown away. So you really need to get site specific and think in terms of locally sourced materials.
Thank you, Marco. Following on from that, other than not using composite materials, what other materials should an architect be specifying, i.e. timber? That's a question from Matt Lambert. I think you're still muted there.
You're muted.
Oh, thanks for that hint. I think the key principle of circular economy here is what we mentioned already, that you can disassemble the building into its parts. And then the second step is really that you can recycle those parts. And I think we touched already on the topic composite materials, which is always not ideal, because when you bring them back in the recycling process, you create a compound, you mix different materials and you lose the quality, and then you end up downcycling it. I think when it comes to wood, it's principally a very good material regarding or for circular buildings. We just work on the Cradle in Düsseldorf, which is a hybrid timber structure building. Also, the walls are made of timber, and even the floor slabs are timber solutions. And we try to avoid cross-laminated timber wherever possible, and rather use the original timber. And the second key point on timber from our perspective is how you treat them. If you add a chemical coating on the timber to protect it from weather, then you destroy the circular economy potential of that timber solution. Because if you burn it at the end in an incineration plant, you release all the pollutants, and that is then sometimes the reason that you can't even burn the timber and you have to dispose it on the landfill, and then it's not really circular anymore. So it, I think, has different components which you have to consider to make it really circular.
Sunand, would you like to give your view on that? I think you're still muted. Sunand, we've lost your sound, unfortunately, so we'll come back with another question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I know, I think that maybe we shouldn't turn our mics off, actually, come to think of it. Very, very quickly, just what I was saying was that, and that's why Maria was smiling, because you couldn't hear a thing I was saying, but you could see me talking, is that there are peg-based mass timber solutions, not just glue. So all of this is actually, don't panic, try to find the solutions. Yes, glues are bad, but we can find other ways.
Okay, thank you.
Peg-based CLT makes me smile too.
Do the panel think, this is a question from Wendy Perring, that we should be designing buildings for a much longer lifespan? This would dramatically reduce the need for C2C. Duncan mentioned that the World Trade Center was not loved. A quote on you, Duncan, so you must have a chance to come back in a moment on that. If we love our buildings and we maintain them, refurbish them and don't demolish them, then our carbon emissions will be slashed. How do we encourage this as a strategy? Let's come to you first then, Duncan.
Yeah, I was referring to the World Trade Center in Brussels, which was buildings that are being that were up for demolition after 20 years of being constructed, and they're currently being deconstructed rather than demolished, and the material is a source for the buildings. Yeah, building for durability, longevity is okay until someone decides they need to build something in its place for whatever reason. So I think durability is good because you might be reducing on the maintenance of your buildings, but and that obviously creates a carbon and ecological footprint. But I don't think we should be, it's almost arrogant to think I've got a really durable, beautiful building that's going to last for 1,000 years, therefore it's all right, because it might be in the way of something in 20 years time and have to come down. So however durable it is, it's still going to be designed for disassembly. That's the big point as far as I'm concerned. But and then if your building's less durable, it's more easy to maintain. But yeah, designing for disassembly is the big deal.
Maria?
Yeah, I agree with Duncan. I just also wanted to add that I think all manner of sins are covered up by this idea that, well, we're designing it for 200 years, so therefore we can, divide the embodied carbon by that 200-year period, and actually, we're looking at a really sustainable building. And so much concrete has been justified in that sense, and it just doesn't make sense to me. And really, we need to be, embodied carbon is split into the upfront carbon, to the literally the carbon that's emitted before the doors open, but there's also an embodied carbon implication of the maintenance. If you have to repair things frequently, and if that repair is disproportionate, to repair something you need to take that whole bloody thing out and then completely replace it rather than being able to replace small elements of it and being able to repair it easily, then you're massively you're locked into an increased embodied carbon over the lifespan of that building. And so I think, as well as designing for disassembly, we need to be designing easily repairable buildings. And this is a movement that exists not to product design, and needs to apply just as strongly to buildings. We need to design buildings that we can, don't chase everything and don't hide everything, make it possible and easy to repair our buildings. And then if you look at the total whole life carbon over the whole lifespan of the building, that you can then make sort of serious statements.
Marco, for the longer lifespan, or do you think it's a bit of a red herring?
I think design for longevity is always what we target for, because what Maria mentioned is, I think, absolutely correct, because you can distribute the upfront emissions in embodied carbon, which is around 50% of the whole life carbon of a project, on a much longer period. And what we often see is that this topic, longevity, is used as an excuse to think about the end of life of the building. We often see with design teams that they don't want to look into the end of life because they are convinced that the building will last forever. And I think that's not true. Every building will have an end of life, and circular economy can contribute to longevity because you can disassemble parts, you can repair the building, and thereby you can extend the lifetime. One thing I just wanted to mention, because we often speak about design for disassembly, I think that's only half the truth. If we can disassemble a building, it doesn't mean that it's circular, because in most cases, the parts can't be recycled, and then we have to bring them to the landfill. So it doesn't really help us. I think this is design for disassembly is only a solution when we are able to combine it with recyclable components. Then we can disassemble the building into parts, and then we can reuse and recycle the parts. And that's, I think, the overall solution of circular economy, which we have to address.
We've got an interesting angle to move on to now, which is from Tim Den Decker, servitization, Philips Lighting at Schiphol Airport. How do we avoid the pitfalls of the previously much vaunted public-private partnerships of the 90s that have now fallen out of favour as they have left public institutions, such as hospital trusts, etc., out of pocket and with poor performance. So we're moving in towards the political ground, which I think we do need to give an opportunity to voice and vent opinions on, because how do we move forward? We've talked about fantastic ideas of the circular economy, but if nothing happens at the top, it's not going to come from the bottom up, is it? Sunand, would you like to pick that up?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant segue from the product as service to the PFI debacle. And I think what it illustrates is that, of course, we need to look for business models which, as the jargon has it, are more outcome driven. But that doesn't mean any business model that's outcome driven works. It depends on the outcomes. And actually, one of the main outcomes of the PFI were the returns on investment from pension funds, which invested massively in PFI. And I don't think that there was sufficient control from the public sector of the deals that they were entering into, because ultimately it was still a binary relationship. There was the public sector and the private sector partner did have different aims and different goals for that. Here at Schiphol, when Philips are providing the lighting, the goals are much more in harmony. They're providing the lighting. I think that, however, if Philips then start making super profits and then sell on that right to other people who might provide it badly, all of that won't work. So business models have to be the right business model and in the right interest. And if it's a public interest, that has to be properly safeguarded. On the political side, I think it is very important to move on to that, because when we struggle very often to find solutions to some of these things, and there was a tiny example I gave earlier about, for example, the cost of new steel as opposed to recycled steel, our economic system is not set up for circularity. And the word economy in circularity means that we actually have to reform the economy as well as do our lovely, comfortable, nerdy things like invent, glueless mass timber, which I now understand is called DLT, by the way. I should have mentioned dowel laminated timber as opposed to CLT, but apparently that's a trademark. So that comfort zone that we have about technological innovation is actually a very important one, and we need to push on with that. But we mustn't neglect that it is not in many, there are many interests which are not aligned with the circular economy, and we need to know what they are. Just as we needed to know that the reduction of carbon emissions was directly in opposition to the interests of energy companies for a very, very long time, until a point when we've reached when those are stranded assets. And why energy assets have become stranded is that there's a genuine realization through real evidence that we cannot go on using them. So when there's a genuine realization that we cannot go on extracting material and creating large dumps of landfill, that same pressure will come onto the economy, and we need to anticipate it, because there isn't much time. We've got to do this very, very soon and get around this.
Let's link to Maria for your answer for this, but before we do, a comment from Matthew online. Go, Maria, take on the capitalist system and its vested interest. So you should answer this with increased enthusiasm.
I'm trying. We don't have the technology at the moment to continue to grow the economy and at the same time reduce our environmental impact. We don't have it. The people that tell you that, oh yeah, what we can do is like, we'll keep growing the economy, we'll make like a weightless economy, we'll make this other version that's like really, it's resource light and it'll be fine. We just don't have the technology for that at the scale that we need. That would require things like microwaving power from orbit. It's that kind of insane technology that we would need in order to enable that decoupling economic growth with resource extraction. It's not possible. So the only way that we are going to be able to live within planetary boundaries is to create an economy that doesn't incentivize this unsustainable growth. Now, obviously, that's a huge problem, and then the solution for that needs to come from the top and from structures in lots of ways as well. But I do believe that we can all be taking actions to help us escape the dependencies on growth at the moment, and we can be taking sort of no regret actions to lay the foundations for that future. We can all be doing that now. So it is a huge problem, but we all have a role to play in that. And the first thing is just to sort of understand that. Everybody needs to maybe do a bit of research and sort of convince yourself that is the case. And then we can together work towards an economy that is based on distribution of resources.
Moving to you, Marco. I mean, extending that, is there a case for a reincarnation of Green Deal that could enshrine C2C, and come up with something that would actually work and get things done and changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we currently see is that regulations and also the Green Deal, driven by the European Union, is really looking and focusing on circular economy, because I think circular economy could be an approach which allows us to continue consumption without leaving a negative footprint. If we consume in the right way, in a circular way, consumption does not necessarily need to be a bad thing. I think what we need is or circular economy would create a disruptive change, and I think it would change our approach from being less bad, which is currently often targeted and the goal, to rather start to do the things different and do them right from the beginning. And I think that's the key ethos of Cradle to Cradle, and it shows a solution where growth and ecology and sustainability is possible without a conflict.
Duncan?
We were talking about leasing lux, weren't we? And got into got into politics quite correctly. I mean, just to be clear, the Philips leasing lux idea it comes from a good place. It comes from the idea of corporate responsibility. So the idea is that Philips end up over the lifetime of the sort of 18-year contract or whatever it is, they end up with the waste from their faulty and old light fittings, and if they're gonna receive all that stuff rather than the end user have to dispose of this stuff and throw it away, they've put in place the mechanisms to deal responsibly with the material that they will receive, and ideally that encourages Philips to design light fittings that are designed as material stores for the future. So it comes from a good place, but there is this problem, which is where it sort of feels a bit like PFI, is that you've got these large multinationals leasing the infrastructure of our cities to us. And so that side of it is a bit scary, but from my point of view, it still comes from a good place. At the moment, millions of people who don't know what they're doing, i.e. us, are asked to throw away Philips light fittings and dispose of them. And we know that's not an easy thing to do, but if Philips have got the mechanism and the infrastructure to do it properly, then it is probably better that we give them that responsibility now. That's the end. Can any of us see the questions?
Dave, are you there?
It seems Dave is not there. But I think maybe just to add from our perspective, few points on the topic ownership, Duncan, what you mentioned. I think that from our perspective is one of the key requirements if we want to see a success in circular economy. I think we would need to achieve that the suppliers who produce products stay in an ownership of the product, because then they create an interest of what happens when they get back the product at the end of the life cycle. And I think that's perfect example is Philips, what you mentioned already. And I think that also has raised the interest of the supplier industry. We currently see, for example, in the interior fit-out product world, you can lease everything. You can lease a complete interior office fit-out. You don't need to own it because there is no point in owning a carpet. And I think there it could be a win-win situation between the owner of the building and also the supplier industry, which helps circular economy a lot in the end.
Okay,
yeah, absolutely. And of course, lifts are already leased, so there's already a track record here. If we haven't got sight of more questions, just to say a bit more about that question on length of life. I think that one of the interesting things about the circular economy is that we have to think about time in a different way in relationship to the life of buildings. It's actually quite a fundamental change. We've had this kind of paradigm that you build a building, you leave it alone, you use it, and then you demolish it. That's actually not normal life. Building is actually much more like a garden or a landscape, that even from the moment you've built it, it needs nurturing, it needs looking after, it naturally needs obviously cleaning, but also minor changes and then major changes. And every now and then the electrics have passed their prime and they need to be replaced. They've become dangerous historically. And so it's a constant cycle. And one of the most interesting ways of looking at that was what was formulated by Frank Duffy and later made more well known by Stuart Brand, which is to think of buildings as layers of an onion almost, where different bits have different lifespans. So, for example, the site has a very long lifetime. The structure maybe that's the bit that has more like a 200-year lifespan. The shell of the building, the outer cladding, if it is not structure, may have a different lifespan. Then there's the interiors, the M&E services, fittings, right down to the furniture and the stuff that surrounds us, the setting and the scenery, as Frank Duffy called it. They have different lifespans. If you see them all in a graded way and then conceive of the building and its life in that nuanced way, then in some ways that discussion about should we just keep buildings going as long as possible becomes how can we maintain every part of this at its highest value for as long as possible. And then we get to the true answer, I think, at the moment, provisionally anyway, to how to tackle that issue of time and buildings.
We are almost at the very end of our presentation, and I'm so sorry that we lost Ruth partway through due to technical difficulties, but I do want to thank everybody for bearing with us. There will be a recording of this, of which we'll naturally be removing the glitch that occurred for a moment or two, but I do want to thank everybody. Maria Smith, Director of Sustainability, Buro Happold, thank you for being with us. Marco Abdallah, Head of Engineering, Drees and Sommer. Duncan Baker-Brown, Senior Lecturer, University of Brighton and co-founder of BBM Sustainable Design, and Sunand Prasad, Principal, Penoyre Prasad. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for bearing with us with our presentation here on Architecture Today with Schueco. We will be back for more in a couple of weeks' time, and we will send you details through. Thank you very much.